Police handcuffed the old man, but the truth shocked everyone in the front yard. Police kicked open the door, yanked the old man from his chair, and slapped cold cuffs on his wrists. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering, while Henry stood frozen, heart pounding, not even knowing his crime. One moment he was sipping tea, the next he was the town's villain. But what no one knew, the truth was about to shake this town to its core. Henry Whitaker's wrists trembled against the cold steel of the handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights painted his wrinkled face in colors of shame as the young officer guided him toward the back seat of the police cruiser. His neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, silhouettes framed in warm light, while he stood in the chilled darkness of his own life, 72 years old, and this was the first time he had ever felt like a criminal. It all started with a moment of confusion. Henry had walked into the grocery store that morning with a pocket full of loose bills and coins. He only needed a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, his dinner for the week. But somewhere between the aisles of cereal and canned soup, he had gotten lost in his thoughts. The laughter of a child reminded him of his own son, who now lived 3 states away, too busy to visit. He wandered out of the store holding the bread and the peanut butter, the money still crumpled in his hand. A security guard stopped him in the parking lot. Moments later, the police arrived. As the car rolled away from the small-town street he had called home for half a century, Henry's mind drifted. He thought of the life he had built here, brick by careful brick. He had served in the army, coached Little League, and fixed every broken porch step on the block without ever asking for thanks. People used to know his name. Now he was just another old man whose memory was fraying like the edges of an old photograph. At the station, a kind officer offered him water. Henry's hand shook as he lifted the paper cup. He wasn't a thief. He was just tired. Tired of living in a world that had learned to look past him. Tired of empty dinners and quiet rooms. Tired of being a ghost in his own story. When the officer finally realized it was an honest mistake and let him go with a warning, Henry shuffled home through streets that no longer felt like his. But something shifted that night. Sitting in his worn recliner, staring at the single photograph on the mantel, his late wife smiling beneath the old oak tree, Henry felt a stirring he hadn't felt in years. The arrest, humiliating as it was, had reminded him of one simple, painful truth. If he didn't reclaim his life now, the world would write his story without him. The next morning, he put on his best flannel shirt and walked to the community center. He signed up for a senior art class, something he hadn't done since high school. He started talking to neighbors again, telling the young ones about the town's history, the summer fairs, the nights the fireflies lit up the creek like a constellation on Earth, and slowly, faces began to turn toward him again. He wasn't invisible anymore. Henry would never forget the sting of those cold handcuffs, the humiliation of that short ride to the station. But he chose to let it be his wake-up call, the spark that pulled him out of the shadows. His story wasn't over, and for the first time in years, he walked down Main Street with his head high, carrying not just a loaf of bread, but the quiet courage to be seen again. The night he was released from the station, the city felt colder than he remembered. Damp streets reflected fractured neon lights, and the air carried the sharp scent of rain on concrete. He stepped into the darkness, an old man with trembling hands, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Hours earlier, they had dragged him in, accusing eyes burning into his soul, the clink of handcuffs cutting deeper than any words. And now, though he was free, he couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was still chasing him. He moved through the streets like a shadow, his worn coat pulled tight against the wind. He knew these streets. Once, decades ago, they had been alive with his music. Back then, his trumpet had sung on corners and in smoky bars, lifting spirits, breaking hearts, making strangers fall in love with melodies they'd never forget. Those nights had smelled of bourbon and beignets, and laughter had followed him home. But that life had been stripped away piece by piece, first his wife, then his home, then his dignity. Now, he was just another invisible soul in a city that never looked back. As he turned down a narrow alley, the silence pressed in. A distant siren wailed, swallowed by the wind. That's when he heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps behind him. His chest tightened. He quickened his pace, his old knees protesting with each hurried step. The footsteps followed. He glanced back but saw only shadows. He slipped into a side street, heart pounding, and pressed himself against the damp brick wall of a shuttered diner. The city lights barely reached this place. He could hear his own breath, ragged and loud, and the relentless footsteps drawing closer. Suddenly, a voice sliced through the dark. "You can't hide from the past, old man." He froze. The voice was calm, almost familiar, but laced with something dangerous. Out of the shadows stepped a tall figure, his face half lit by the flickering street lamp. For a moment, the old man's mind spun, trying to place him. And then it hit like a punch. This was a face from another lifetime, a face he thought he would never see again. The stranger's eyes locked on his, cold but not without a glimmer of something unspoken recognition, maybe even pain. "I know who you are," the man said, voice low, "and I know what you left behind." The old man's throat went dry. He had spent years burying the past, burying the truth. He thought if he kept moving, kept quiet, no one would ever find him. But here it was, rising up like a ghost in the middle of the night. "Please." His voice trembled. "I've got nothing left." "That's where you're wrong," the stranger replied, taking a step closer. "You have everything to lose, and someone out there is already looking for you." In that moment, a cold dread washed over him, heavier than the handcuffs had ever been. It wasn't just the law chasing him anymore. It was history, regret, and a secret that refused to stay buried. He realized that tonight was not an ending, but the beginning of something he had tried to escape his whole life. From somewhere in the distance, the rumble of an approaching car broke the stillness. The stranger glanced toward the sound, then back at him, voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move. Now, or neither of us is making it out of this alive." The old man hesitated, his mind a storm of fear and disbelief. He didn't know if he could trust this man, but in the heavy, breathless silence of that alley, he also knew he had no choice. He stepped forward, into the darkness, toward a future he could no longer avoid. Blood glistened under the pale streetlight, a dark, wet trail that led nowhere. The old man stood frozen, his breathing uneven, his mind screaming to run. Moments ago, the street had been empty, quiet, safe. And now, a stranger lay dead at his feet, eyes staring blankly at the night sky, as if searching for an answer he would never find. Before the old man could even process what had happened, the sharp glare of headlights split the darkness. A black sedan rolled silently into the alley, its tires whispering over the wet cobblestones. His heart hammered. For one fleeting moment, he thought salvation had come. Someone had seen the murder. Someone had come to help. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. A tall man stepped out, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the night. He moved with a predatory calm, his gloved hands catching the faint glimmer of the streetlight. There was no rush in his stride, no shock in his face. He was a man who had walked this path before. The old man instinctively stumbled back. I didn't see anything," he stammered, his voice hoarse and weak. The man didn't answer. He crouched, picked up the dead stranger's wallet and tucked it into his pocket. Then he straightened and pressed a single finger to his lips. Silence, a command, a threat. A chill like ice water poured down the old man's spine. His legs trembled, and when he tried to step back, his heels slipped on the slick stone. He fell hard, scraping his palms, his breath knocked out of him. By the time he pushed himself upright, the car was gone. So was the man. The alley was empty, the world eerily still, as though nothing had ever happened except for the blood that stained his trembling hands. Panic rose in his throat. He reached for his phone, gone. His heart raced faster. He staggered out into the main street, desperate for help. That's when the wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder, closer. Relief flickered for an instant before he saw his reflection in a darkened shop window. Blood smeared across his face, his hands, his coat. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a killer. The police car screeched to a stop, tires splashing through puddles. Two officers jumped out, guns drawn. Hands where we can see them. He raised his shaking hands, his voice breaking. Please, I can explain. On the ground. Now. Cold pavement bit into his knees. His chest heaved as he tried to form the words, to tell them about the man, the car, the silence. But the story sounded insane even in his own head. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Cuffs snapped around his wrists, and the weight of the night crushed him. He was being dragged into the police car like a criminal. Behind him, the alley swallowed its secrets. Then, just as the door closed, something in the mirror caught his eye. Far down the alley, two faint red dots glowed in the shadows like eyes. Watching, waiting. The man hadn't left. He was hunting, and the old man realized, with a shudder that shook his bones, that he was now a piece in someone else's game, a game where the rules were written in blood, and survival meant staying one step ahead of a predator who had already won once tonight. ChatGPT Danoy. Under the dim yellow light of the jail cell, the old man sat hunched over, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. The chill of the concrete seeped into his bones, and the metallic tang of fear clung to the air. He had never been in trouble before, never even had a parking ticket, and now he was the prime suspect in a crime that had shattered his small, quiet life. He closed his eyes and tried to slow his breathing, but all he could hear was the echo of the past few hours, the screams, the sirens, the weight of the handcuffs snapping shut on his thin wrists. He thought of his home, his little kitchen where the smell of tea and old books lingered. It felt like another life, another world. Here, the world was stripped down to shadows and cold metal. He had tried to explain himself, to tell the officers that he was innocent, that he had only been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in their eyes, he was already guilty. Their stares had been sharp, like knives cutting through the fragile shell of his dignity. The hours passed slowly, twisting into one another. Sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the building made him flinch. Then, in the dead silence of night, he heard it, a soft scrape, like a whisper of metal against metal. He froze. His heart thudded so loudly he thought the whole world could hear it. The cell door clicked. He lifted his head, and his blood turned to ice. A figure stood there, tall and thin, dressed in black from head to toe, as if the night itself had slithered in through the cracks. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but the voice that came out was low, steady, and far too calm. You talk too much, the figure said. The old man's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words stuck, trembling with the weight of his fear. He knew that voice. He had heard it in the alley when the world had gone mad, when blood stained the street and his life had turned upside down. The man stepped into the cell, moving like smoke, like he didn't belong to the same world as everyone else. You saw me, he said. That's a problem. The old man pressed back against the wall, wishing he could melt into it. He had never been brave, never been strong. His whole life had been built on routine, on safety. Now, he was face to face with the storm that had torn that life apart. But maybe, the man continued, crouching so close their eyes met, maybe you can be useful. The old man's pulse hammered. He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. The stranger's gloved hand reached out, gripping his chin with the cold weight of control. There are two kinds of people in this world, the man whispered. Hunters and prey. Which are you? Tears burned in the old man's eyes. He wanted to scream that he wasn't either, that he just wanted to go home, to drink his tea, to live the rest of his life in peace. But all that came out was a broken whisper. I don't want to die. A small, chilling smile curved the man's lips. He slid something across the bench, a key, cold and gleaming under the dim light. Then listen carefully, the man said. Tonight, you walk out of here. No one will stop you. But from this moment, your life belongs to me. The old man stared at the key. His hands trembled as he picked it up, the weight of it sinking into his soul. He understood now that freedom wasn't free. It came with chains you couldn't see, chains that wrapped around the heart and pulled it into darkness. When the figure vanished into the night, the old man sat frozen for a long moment, his pulse echoing in the empty cell. And then, moving like a ghost, he used the key. The door opened without a sound. He stepped into the hallway, each footfall a quiet betrayal of everything he had been before. The jail, the city, the world, they all seemed to hold their breath as he walked into the darkness. And for the first time in his life, he realized that survival had a price, and he had just agreed to pay it. The square was silent when the verdict rang out. Not guilty. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then, slowly, as if carried by the wind, the whispers began. Faces turned toward Henry, faces that had once glared with suspicion, spat accusations, and hurled stones of doubt. Now they trembled, eyes wide with shame. The late afternoon sun bled across the town, painting the old courthouse in amber and gold, as though nature itself had been holding its breath for this moment. Henry did not move at first. He stood there, his shoulders squared, his weathered hands steady by his sides. He had imagined this day through countless sleepless nights, but the reality of it felt heavier, more fragile. He could hear the uneven breaths of the townsfolk, could almost feel their guilt hanging in the air like a thick fog. Then, from the crowd, a single figure emerged, a man who had once led the charge to condemn him. His boots scraped against the gravel as he crossed the square. The man stopped just a few feet away, his chest rising and falling, his eyes glistening. And then, to the shock of all, he knelt. The sound of his knees hitting the earth was like a thunderclap in the silence. A murmur rippled through the gathering, and soon, one by one, others lowered their heads, unable to bear the weight of their own shame. Henry's throat tightened. He could have spoken in anger. He could have demanded justice for every night spent in the darkness of doubt, every cruel word that had scraped against his soul. But he only looked at them, really looked. In that quiet, he saw fear giving way to humility, and something inside him softened. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried through the square like a hymn. "The truth," he said, pausing to lift his eyes to the horizon, where the sun was folding itself into the edge of the world, "always finds its way home. You only have to stand firm and believe." No one moved. The words seemed to settle over the town like falling leaves, fragile yet unshakable. Some wiped their eyes, others simply bowed their heads lower. Henry turned then, walking down the old dirt road that led out of the square, past the rusted gates and the creaking fences that had witnessed his quiet suffering. The world around him seemed sharper, more alive. He noticed the way the light caught the drifting leaves, each one a fragment of gold spinning in the wind. His boots crunched softly against the path, the rhythm of each step carrying him closer to the life he had nearly lost. By the time he reached the edge of his land, the sun was sinking into a pool of crimson and rose, and the long shadows of the trees stretched like arms welcoming him home. The road was blanketed with amber leaves, whispering beneath his feet, and the gentle warmth of the fading day set his silver hair aglow. At the porch of his weathered house, he paused. There, on the old wooden railing, a small bird had landed a quiet sentinel, its feathers catching the last threads of light. It tilted its head, as if in greeting, and for a moment Henry felt as though the earth itself was offering him a sign. Freedom, vindication, the return of truth to its rightful home. He stood there for a while, just listening to the wind and the soft rustle of leaves. No crowd, no noise, only the stillness of peace, hard-earned and fragile. Behind him, the town would carry its guilt for years, and maybe that was enough. Henry's lips curved into the faintest smile. He lifted his eyes to the darkening sky and whispered to himself, a vow and a benediction all in one. The truth always comes home. And with that, he stepped into his house, leaving the door ajar. As the little bird took flight into the twilight, a fleeting shadow against the horizon, carrying with it a quiet reminder that some endings are not an end at all, but the beginning of a gentler tomorrow. There comes a moment in every life when the world seems to turn its back on you, when the whispers of doubt grow louder than the voice of truth. Henry's story is not just about pain or injustice. It is about what it means to hold on to your dignity when everything around you urges you to give it up. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the weight of misunderstanding, his journey is a gentle but powerful awakening. The greatest lesson Henry leaves behind is simple but profound. Never abandon the truth, because the truth will never abandon you. Even when the world points its finger, even when friends and neighbors forget the kindness you've shown, you must stand firm in who you are. Life has its own rhythm, and the river of time has a way of washing away lies, leaving only the stones of truth shining in the sunlight. Henry didn't need to scream or fight. He endured with quiet courage, and that is why, in the end, the truth walked home to him like an old friend. For us, especially in our later years, this story asks a question that cannot be ignored. Are we living in a way that honors our own hearts, even if the world misunderstands us? There is a dignity in patience, in choosing faith over bitterness, in trusting that the seeds of our goodness will one day bloom no matter how long the winter lasts. That is the moral Henry whispers to us. Let your soul remain steady. Let your heart remain kind. Do not let falsehoods turn you into someone unrecognizable, because no storm lasts forever. When I think of Henry walking that golden road home, leaves crunching softly under his feet, the setting sun lighting his silver hair, I imagine a quiet voice in the wind saying, "You made it. You stayed true." And that is enough. A small bird landing on his porch that evening became more than just a bird. It was a symbol. Freedom, redemption, the return of all that is right. That image stays with me because it tells us that the world does eventually notice, and that peace comes to those who do not abandon themselves. To everyone listening, especially our beloved senior audience, take this story into your own life. Remember, your worth is not defined by rumors or by the impatience of others. Stand tall in your integrity, and let your kindness be your shield. The truth always finds its way home, and when it does, it carries a light that softens the years of waiting and turns pain into quiet victory. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts with us. Leave a comment with the lesson it awakened in you, because your words may guide someone else through their own storm. Subscribe to our channel and stay with us for more stories that bring not just entertainment, but lessons that feed the soul. Thank you for listening, and may your day be filled with calm, strength, and the gentle reminder that holding on to the truth is the most powerful act of all.